This is a University of Otago podcast.
Well, good evening and thanks very much for your welcome. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and the mountains, the rivers, the air, the waters that sustain all of us. Thank you very much to the New Zealand Law Foundation once again. This is I think the third university that I'm now visiting in this academic tour, and it's a great privilege to be here at the University of Otago. Being this close to Antarctica is kind of nice. Tonight I'm going to talk about climate change and biodiversity and look at the links between the two, particularly in relation to the way in which they combine as a set of issues when we are thinking about protected areas. And what I want to do is to argue for an approach that needs a great deal more work, but an integrated approach to the environmental law and policy concerning both of these areas. So this is my outline, and what I will do is to look at some of the main headings of this. I won't have time to go through all of this in any detail, but I want to give you a whole range of examples, and every time that I give an example I want you to think about what it means for the law, what it means particularly for international and national environmental law. So, in examining the intersections between conservation of biological diversity and the phenomenon of climate change, we need to be aware of the problem of climate change. Climate has always changed. But the problem has been that in the last 250 years or so, it is changing at a much greater rate than the background rate, by which I mean the rate at which it would have changed if human beings had not impacted the Earth in the way that they have in the past 250 or 300 years. And what we need to look at is ways in which climate change effects can be addressed, both from the point of view of such things as the Kyoto Protocol and the successor to the Kyoto Protocol, which is being debated this year in Durban in South Africa, but also to look particularly at the alternatives to what you might call Plan A. And Plan B has got to do with natural solutions. And that's what I want to focus on from the point of view of looking at biodiversity and protected areas. When we think about protected areas, as we'll see, I think about both terrestrial and marine protected areas, although some analysts also refer to parts of the air as protected areas, particularly when you're thinking about the Convention on Migratory Species. One of the things that I'll talk about, though, as a part of this whole debate is this question of connectivity conservation and ecosystem-based approaches to climate change. First, though, let me think with you through the kind of approach that we need to take in environmental law. We shouldn't just take a sectoral approach, looking at air quality or water quality or the degradation or conservation of land, but we need to take a much more holistic approach. We need to think about the cultural and historical interactions with the land and how we understand them, how we understand our interactions with each other, because that is one of the keys to addressing the environmental problems that we have created. We also need to think about the issue of population and population control, and of course we need to think about indigenous peoples. In other words, then, we need to take an integrated approach to how we think about the environment itself, and then we need to think about how environmental law and policy ought to be further integrated. Because to date, in many developing countries particularly, but also in developed countries, we have a fairly fragmented approach to the development of environmental law and policy. And this is one of the problems that we face in addressing both biodiversity loss and climate change. But we need to bear in mind that ecosystems are interdependent and we are part of those ecosystems. So this is a graphic that was developed by UNEP a few years ago, which shows some of this idea. It's no mistake that this is a spider's web. The law itself is a spider's web. It doesn't matter where you go in or where you go out. If you shake a little bit of it, something else happens in other areas. Ecosystems are much the same. If you affect one part of the ecosystem, other parts are also affected. It's a part of what they call the chaos theory, or the butterfly effect theory, where a pair of butterfly wings might flap in Dunedin, and in Wuhan in China you might get a storm 3 years later. That's the kind of idea that the chaos theory talks about. So essentially then, ecosystems are interconnected, and the scientists amongst you do not need this to be underlined, but lawyers need to understand this. Basically, there's a delicate balance, a delicate equilibrium, which Al Gore referred to when he wrote his book back in 1992, Earth in the Balance. He meant that in a number of ways. But when we think about particularly aspects of environmental activity for which humans have been responsible, particularly such things as logging, we can think about it in a whole range of ways in terms of loss of biodiversity, the decrease in the ability of ecosystems to produce oxygen for us and for the rest of the earth, as well as in terms of the ability of forests to absorb greenhouse gases, which can then affect local climate, availability of water, and so on. So by looking at forests, by looking at soil, and by looking at the coastal and marine environment and how they interact, we see that by environmental degradation of these areas, that this can contribute to loss of biodiversity on the one hand and climate change effects on the other. But the link between biodiversity and climate change is very complex and in many cases quite close. So what I would talk about here is that we are facing a two-faceted crisis. When we think about the environment these days, we think mainly about climate change. But I would argue that we have just as serious a problem with biodiversity, and that those two issues are linked. So whilst there's a widespread realization that we have to address anthropogenic or human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, we need also to think about biodiversity loss, because we're in, at this stage, the 6th wave of extinction, and we are at the very late stage of human development here in terms of it being what some people call 3 minutes to midnight. 5 mass extinction events over very, very long periods of geological time, but the latest one started, some analysts say, some 8,000 years ago when humans started farming, when they started turning over the agricultural lands for planting of crops and grazing of animals. Others would say that as far as the actual really significant events are concerned, it's 250 or 300 years ago when we started digging up the coal and burning it for industrial purposes. But certainly it's the case that we are in now the 6th wave of extinction, and that extinction is caused by human activity. And it's a problem to do with population on the one hand and consumption on the other. Lester Brown talks about 1.5 Earths being required to address our needs in the future. Some other analysts say 5 or 6 Earths over a period of time would be required if we assume that the present rate of consumption that we have in the West will be replicated in China and India in particular over the next few years. Well, how are biodiversity and climate connected? Frogs tend to be one of the indicators of this connection. Frogs are very important in terms of the medicines derived from secretions of frogs, both from their skin and from other parts of their body, in terms of producing powerful antibiotic chemicals which can be used in medical research for stopping the rejection, for instance, of organ donations into humans. And as one of the websites says, they can stop us from croaking. I wish I had something that would stop me from croaking in the last week in a different sense. In any case, the Southern Gastric Brooding Frog, which is turning out to be one of my favourites, it was discovered back in the 1970s, and it was known to people for about 10 years, and then it disappeared. Why was this frog important? Well, we'll see that this frog swallows its eggs. After they're fertilised by the male, the female swallows the eggs, and there can be up to 20 to 40 eggs that it swallows. And then it doesn't eat for 6 weeks. And the explanation is here if you want to look at it, but basically the eggs once hatched produce a prostaglandin which turns off basically the production of hydrochloric acid in the stomach of the frog, which means that the eggs and then the tadpole does not go through the digestive system of the mother. So in other words, it turns off the digestive system, and the mother in any case doesn't eat. And then after a few weeks, the mother regurgitates the frog from her tummy, and sometimes it can be done in one explosive vomit. It doesn't say that up there, but that's what the scientific literature talks about. Or it can do it over a period of a week if it is relatively relaxed. But why is this important? The reason why it's important is because, having lost that frog, we have lost the medical research that would have gone into it in terms of the chemicals that it produced, because it's a very rare frog. It's an Australian frog in a northern Queensland rainforest. This is just one example. There are 14 frog species that have gone extinct. This is the most spectacular. But there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of species of animals, particularly animals of this kind, which can contribute to medical science research, which can be of benefit to human beings. So this is just one example. And a lot of work has been done on this by, for instance, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in terms of conserving medicinal species. So on the one hand, we see the tiny effects in terms of climate change, in terms of habitat loss and so forth, which have produced frog extinctions and extinctions of other small creatures. But it's the large-scale environmental changes that we really need to think about in terms of the effects on the world as a whole. Ice melt is one that we have thought about a great deal, and both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, as well as in Greenland, we see what the effects are. In mountain ecosystems, as we'll see in a moment, they are also of huge significance, with mountain ecosystems covering some 25% of the Earth's terrestrial area. Of course, there are mountain ecosystems underneath the sea, but they have very different ecosystemic characteristics. But we also see issues to do with changes in marine ecosystems because of the reversal of the Ocean Circulation Conveyor belt and changes in coral reefs. And as we'll see, also grassland changes. So you may have seen some of these images, but this is just some of the images that are available publicly in terms of what happens with the South Pole in terms of ice melt over the summer. The summer ice used to, of course, be much larger than it is now on average. We see this in terms of various shelves carving over great rates, 20 and 30 kilometres of ice shelves falling into the ocean. These, of course, don't have a particular effect on sea level rise because they're already floating, but nevertheless are indicative of the changes that are happening in parts of the Antarctic. We see dramatic changes in the Arctic as well. Over a period of just 10 or 15 years, you see this kind of change happening. It's much more drastic now. And this is what happens, that you have polar bears being isolated on ice floes. Polar bears need to move from one ice floe to the other in order to be able to survive. They can't stay in the water all the time, and they need to be able to hunt. How can you hunt a seal if you're sitting on an ice floe and can't swim very fast? This is another issue, and this is again where the link between climate change and biodiversity is particularly real. Because this is what they call a pizzly or a grolar, first discovered just about 10 years ago. This is a picture from the Canadian Geographic, where a polar bear and a grizzly have interacted, and there are now a number of them, some in museums. And the reason why they've interacted is because of the ranges overlapping. That the grizzly bear, because it's warmer, goes further north into the North Pole, right around. And the polar bear, because it's hungry, goes south into the tundra in order to eat. And then inevitably, over time, they interbreed. This has happened, for example, in zoos accidentally, but the picture I showed you was the first time it was recorded in the wild. The problem then of ice sheet melting is something that we need to be very much aware of. And it's just as important down here in the south as it is in the north. With the Greenland ice sheet melting, you see that there are some major issues there. The Greenlanders, of course, would say, well, some of this is good. We can now grow vegetables. We can farm further north and so forth. But if you read the scientific literature, you'll see that if the whole of the Greenland ice cap melted, then you'd have a sea level rise over a period of time, and we're talking about long period of time, of something like 17 metres. In other words, that pretty much all of our coastal cities would be inundated right around the world. And then the Ocean Circulation Conveyor belt, where the warm shallow currents swap with the cold and salty deep currents, that can affect, of course, all coastal climates right around the world as well. The Great Barrier Reef, which no doubt many of you have been to, you'll be aware that back in the later 90s there was a major coral reef bleaching both in Australia and in around Asia, in Indonesia and Philippines and so on. Which meant that for quite some time the reefs in certain parts looked like this. With 1 degree of sea temperature rise, you can have ocean bleaching. Then we have this kind of phenomenon with mountains, where we see the melting of the glaciers right around the world. This is just one model from the 1800s through to the late 2000s. But you can do this kind of model more or less with many glaciers, whether it's in Switzerland or in the Canadian Rockies or in South America or in Nepal and Tibet. So these kinds of phenomena mean that there is a very close interaction between rising ambient temperatures and biodiversity. That if you look at this graph here, you'll see that each of these is a different descriptor of the ecosystems, and that they change by moving up the mountain as things get warmer. So it's not just on the coasts, and it's not just in island environments, but it's also in the mountain environments, such as in the Andes, in the Colombian Andes in this case, where there is high vulnerability because of the changes in temperature. Things such as water flow regulation, food supply, soil changes affect a wide range of issues, and in particular, in places like this particular range, you have issues to do with the supply of water in the city of Bogota. But recently also in the Serengeti, we have a disturbing phenomenon. The present government of Tanzania is planning to build a road from one side of the Serengeti right through the middle to the other side. You might say, well, it's going to be a gravel road, it's not going to have a great deal of influence. Well, wildebeest are very sensitive animals. They migrate annually because they have to. They migrate about 500 kilometres. And they migrate because of feeding needs, water needs and breeding needs. By building a road right through this area, the ecologists argue, are likely to have their annual migration patterns severely disrupted, and that can produce changes to the grassland ecosystems, which are of course fed upon by the many thousands of wildebeest, and those grassland changes can contribute to changes in the climate. In the Amazon, you have exactly the same problem, where you've got 8 countries around the Amazon, Brazil being the largest owner of Amazonian rainforest, where you've got a cutting away of trees by a whole range of people in each of these countries. Very complex area, and from a legal point of view, very interesting, because of the Amazon Cooperation Treaty between the 8 countries. In fact, 9 countries, because French Guiana is in there as well, where they are trying to actually reduce the amount of deforestation because of biodiversity loss and because of climate change effects. And the Arc of Deforestation is mainly in the south, but going northwards, but also in all of these pockets. Here I've had the opportunity to fly with the Brazilian Air Force just a year and a half, 2 years ago, from Manaus right into the middle of the Brazilian rainforest to have a look at some of these areas. And as you can imagine, if you've been there yourself, you'll know that these are just extraordinarily beautiful and very important areas. They are the lungs of the world. What do we do about it? Well, biodiversity loss affects pretty much every continent, large and small. We see this particularly in terms of biodiversity hotspots, which are basically small or relatively small areas of high endemicity. In other words, areas where species of plants and animals concentrate and propagate. And they are the areas that many organisations such as Conservation International look at and say, well, we have to particularly protect these because of the high concentrations of rare species. The red list of the IUCN, of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, of course, is a very important aspect of management tools, but with the IUCN and with all of the other things that are going on with Conservation International, what is missing in a great deal of the reports is a legal component. And this is where the lawyers come in and say, well, look, we have to know on the one hand about the science, and on the other, we need to then be able to talk to the scientists and apply their knowledge in a way which is legally sensible in order to actually address all of these issues and to address them in an integrated way. Well, these are the conventions related to biodiversity, starting from 1971 through to 1973 with the Convention on International Trade, the 1972 World Heritage Convention, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Biodiversity Convention of 1992, the Climate Change Convention, which, as we will see, does have a good deal now to do with biodiversity through the documents that are coming out in the Kyoto debate that is happening at the present time. And then the Convention on Desertification is also a biodiversity-related convention, although it's a fairly narrow one, and one, in my view, which is unsatisfactory and needs to be further developed. But what is happening in the last 10 years particularly is that the scientists have realised we need to have some synergy between these conventions in terms of what the secretariats do, what the legal officers do, what the scientific officers do. So they've set up a joint liaison group between the three Rio conventions and climate change, biodiversity and desertification, and then a broader liaison group relating to the other conventions that I've listed, together with the 2001 Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. So that's starting to happen, but it's by no means enough in terms of what is required from an international policy point of view, as well as in terms of the need to ensure that the legal mechanisms are robust and are implemented adequately. So what I would argue is that looking at the ways in which these conventions are being dealt with at an international level, we need to translate that into what is happening into our own national environmental law and policy. Some countries that is happening. In New Zealand, with your RMA, you've been doing this for quite some time. It's up to you to judge how successfully that might be. But in Australia, through the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999, which is some 8 years or so after the RMA, we also did it at federal level in terms of integrating the responsibilities under these conventions, naming them specifically and setting up mechanisms and management principles in the regulations in order to address these responsibilities. But it's still by no means enough in countries such as ours, let alone countries such as India and China, where there's so much environmental law work that still needs to be done. If you look at this particular region, in the Pacific Island region, you see that only 2 or 3 small island developing countries have got adequate legislation. And a great deal more work needs to be done for ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change on the one hand, and the discouragement of biodiversity for its own sake on the other. That is starting to happen, and there are projects which are being organised by the Pacific Regional Environment Programme which are addressing this, but again it's still at a relatively early stage, and for some countries it will be too little, too late. Nevertheless, we need to take a positive approach. And when we look particularly at the role of protected areas, we see that there is some hope here in terms of working outside the square, and in particular going beyond the question of emissions trading and carbon taxes and the formal role of a post-Kyoto protocol or agreement, and looking at other ways to address these issues, which can then be brought into the Kyoto succession process. So we see that climate change is already having a major impact on biodiversity around the world, from the marine environment, the coastal plains, and up into the mountains. We see that there is a great need for a good deal more site-specific conservation goals that need to be generated and addressed. But most particularly from our point of view, there needs to be clear, comprehensive, legally backed adaptation strategies. So when we think about a protected area, this is the latest definition generated by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, a clearly defined geographical space recognised, dedicated and managed through legal and other effective means to achieve long-term conservation of nature. Well, a clearly defined geographical space. That can be either land or sea. It could be the air, blocks of air above land. Dedicated, what they mean is long-term dedication. We're not talking about something that is the subject of a lease or a 50-year covenant. but thinking through the management, having it adequately managed according to adequate management principles. And the International Union for Conservation of Nature has produced such principles. For each of the categories, there are 6 categories, as some of you will know, of the IUCN in terms of protected areas, from strict nature reserves and wilderness areas right through to what are called sustainable development areas, and then national parks and land and seascapes being found in between. But recognised, dedicated and managed through legal and other effective means. Now, in this region, particularly in the South Pacific, we see that other effective means are being used, particularly through traditional or customary law, to place taboos, for example, on the culling of particular species of marine or land animals, and so on. So that's what that means, other effective means to achieve long-term conservation of nature, focusing on the conservation of nature, not of biodiversity as such. So how do we do this? Well, protected areas can address climate change issues in a whole range of ways, particularly through what we call biosequestration. And the RED mechanism, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, are one way that this can happen and has been recognised from the Copenhagen Accord onwards. And this is going to become increasingly important as we move into the climate talks in Durban. But we can also see that soils are an increasingly recognised important carbon sink, because soils can sequestrate something like 80% of terrestrial carbon, and the rest, on land at least, is some 20%. But soils need a great deal more attention than have been given in the past. We've got one convention on desertification, but we don't have another international convention. And I've been working actually for some years on generating a protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity in order to actually encourage a focus on the conservation of soil as a biodiversity resource. But these days, we need also to think about soil from the point of view of a carbon sink. There's a whole range of other ways in which soil can be thought about, but that is the main one. There's also a crucial role of oceans to play in climate change. As being the Earth's main buffer to climate change, we see that it also bears the greatest burdens. It removes a huge amount of carbon per year, and just in a scientific study, over some 7 years, it was shown some 25%. But the point is that the health of the ocean influences the capacity of oceans to absorb carbon by all kinds of chemical changes to do with acidification. So acidification reduces the capacity, for example, to absorb carbon. Nevertheless, there's some good stories to be told here, and one of them is that whilst the marine environment is protected to only less than 1% of its area, we see that there is an aim under the Convention on Biological Diversity Strategic Plan, which was set up in October last year in Nagoya, to increase the marine protected areas of state to 10%. What does that mean in terms of marine protected areas and fisheries in places like New Zealand and Australia? In Australia, it's quite controversial, where some state governments want to reduce the areas of marine protection. And in places like New Zealand, I'm sure there are similar issues. By increasing the areas which can be converted to MPAs, we can actually encourage the growth of marine forests to absorb carbon, giant kelp beds particularly, seagrasses, seaweeds, as well as, of course, coastal mangroves. None of these, at this stage, are incorporated in the national greenhouse gas inventories in the same way, for example, that forests are under what is called the Australia Clause in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. But one of the questions that one would have immediately is, what is the role of international environmental law and national environmental law in promoting marine forests? Well, kelp forests are carbon sinks. They absorb a huge amount of carbon, according to one particular study. But the problem is that there is a fair degree of threat to coastal kelp because of overfishing, which disturbs the ecosystems in various ways, and storm waves. One way to actually encourage carbon sinks through kelp is to have artificial reefs on which the kelp can fix. So there's a whole range of scientific ways in which this can be dealt with. It's not focused on as an important aspect at this stage, but I would contend that over the next 5 or 6 years, this is going to become much more important as the scientific analyses become more well known. And here is just a picture of a bed of kelp off the Otago Peninsula. New Zealand has a lot of this stuff, and it could contribute in the future to your national greenhouse gas emission inventory. How do you measure it? Well, they measure carbon in forests very nicely through satellite work, and there's all kinds of ways in which this is done, but they can actually now tell just exactly how much carbon is in a particular piece of vegetation through satellite imagery and through the various light images that they get into their cameras. The same can be done, it seems, for marine forests. Well, when we look at protected areas globally, we see that there is a huge growth from 1872 in Yellowstone, 1882, and I'm sorry to be Australia-centric, but Australia had the second national park in the world, and that is the Royal, just south of Sydney, but then going from pretty much zero right up to where it is now. It's at 2011, it's gone somewhat higher to over 20,000 areas covering something like 120,000 square kilometres. And this is just a graph showing the percentage from one area to another. The protected areas in Australia and New Zealand, these are under the IUCN categories. This does not actually mean that all of the green bits are protected. All it means is that those dots represent particular areas that have been categorised and are under protection, but of course they're much smaller areas. And this is of course an issue, as I'll come to in a minute. When we look at expanding the global protected areas estate, I already mentioned the expansion of marine areas, but there's also a target for terrestrial areas. This is the target. By 2020, at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas should be part of the protected areas estate on a global basis. So 70% of land and 10% of the global water. How are we going to achieve this? What role is law going to play in achieving these things? This, as you can imagine, is going to be politically difficult, economically very expensive in certain countries and certain regions, and legally quite difficult as well, as I will attempt to show in a moment, in terms of thinking through the whole area of connectivity conservation. But just expanding from something like 11.5% of the terrestrial environment now, from 11.5% through to 17% by 2020, in other words, some 9 years, is a fairly big ask. But the 9% that is required from 1% or less than 1% of the marine and coastal areas up to 10% is going to be even more difficult. But we need, as environmental lawyers and policymakers, to think through how this is going to work. The other aspect is ecosystem-based adaptation for climate change. And this, of course, depends on robust ecosystems, or ecosystems that will become robust because of policy and law that addresses the expansion of protected areas and in particular ecosystem resilience. And the IUCN, for example, talks about sustainable water management, disaster risk reduction in relation particularly to coastal habitat, sustainable grassland management in many countries, reducing forest fires. When you think about the forest fires in Australia, how much in the last 3 or 4 years that has contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally also expanding protected areas. And here are some of the publications just out in the last year or two. The latest one's just on the left, and then the IUCN one last year and this one a couple of years ago from the Convention on Biological Diversity. Again, great science, really interesting stuff. But how do you translate this from a legal point of view into legislative guidelines which are going to make sense from an economic and from a political acceptability point of view? This is the challenge that we face. Well, this is being met to a certain extent by various organisations, including the IUCN, and these guidelines for protected areas legislation, which I've had the privilege of working on with the main author and looking at the whole way in which these case studies work, is something that will be one of the tools, one of the instruments which will come up with new ways of addressing biodiversity and climate change. These are 15 reviews of various kinds of land and marine tenure to do with protected areas in a wide range of countries, but there are only 15. There are 192 countries belonging to the United Nations. A great number of them do not have adequate protected areas law. China, for example, has been working for the last 10 years on protected areas law. Whilst it has national parks, they're not well protected, not well managed. Nevertheless, China, with a population of 1.367 billion people, needs protected areas in much the same way, if not more so, than we do. Connectivity conservation of protected areas. Well, we need new legal tools to actually enable them as well. And I'll just give you another Australian example. This is our National Reserve system. We've got a lot of land in National Reserve. In fact, from the marine point of view, I don't have the slide for it, but from a marine point of view, you've got something like 10% already of Australian coastal and marine areas in MPAs, in marine protected areas, primarily because of the Great Barrier Reef. We have such a high percentage, but nevertheless, we're already at the global target. But in my view, we're still, with such a huge coastline of something like 37,000 kilometres, we could do a lot more. From a terrestrial point of view, we have a reasonable amount. But when you look at it, the problem is that they're not connected. And the work that Graham Warboys, for example, is doing in ecosystem, in connectivity management, is starting to connect them. And I'll just give you one example. The Australian Alps to Atherton initiative, or the Great Eastern Ranges initiative, is being looked at seriously by the various governments from Victoria, from the ACT, the New South Wales and Queensland. When you think about it in terms of joining up all of these areas into one protected area, in other words, that they're linked by bridges over roads or tunnels for animals to get through and so forth, this is a huge legal task. It's got to do with negotiating with state governments, with local councils, and in particular with the private sector, where farmlands, for example, forests privately owned or managed, need to be linked up into one whole ecosystem corridor. Great work for environmental lawyers to be able to do, but this is just one of hundreds of examples around the world where this needs to occur. In South America, you can do the same kind of map, and they're doing this kind of map in order to show what the possibilities are. But again, lawyers are not directly involved in this in the way they should be. The World Commission on Protected Areas of the IUCN, of which I'm a member, is actually starting to look at this. I have the privilege of being the head as a co-chair of a group of lawyers who are looking at this in various ways. And one of the things we're focusing on is how to actually set up the legislative models required to ensure ecosystem resilience through conservation corridors. Exciting stuff, but we need hundreds of lawyers looking at this around the world, not just 30. So basically, all of this is underlain by a philosophy of thinking through using the natural aspects of Earth and the way in which it can rebalance itself by what they call natural solutions. And this particular publication, which is available on the web, was published just a year ago and sets out a whole range of natural solutions in terms of protected areas being able to contribute to the reduction of impacts of climate change. But when you look at this report on pages 92 and 93, it's about 5 paragraphs on what you might call the legal aspects in over 100 pages of analysis. And what the scientists need to realise is that we as lawyers and as environmental policy makers need to be involved in this in order to ensure that the science that is being put together is adequately implemented on the ground at a national, regional and international level. So my conclusion is that we need to actually take an approach which takes on a whole range of mechanisms. A broader range of approaches need to be taken from a legal point of view as well as from the point of view of policy development. And we need to incorporate those approaches in the same way as REDD is being incorporated at the moment. We need to think about it from a terrestrial and from a marine point of view in terms of biosequestration. And in order to make the whole system more effective, we need to take a more integrated approach between the conventions themselves and then what happens at a national level. One thing I haven't talked about is the cooperation at a regional level, but clearly in this region, New Zealand, Australia and the 15 independent countries of the Pacific could do a whole lot more in terms of taking more common approaches at a regional level. And that is starting to happen, but it's something that needs a great deal more work. Well, you know, I'm staying at this wonderful executive residence down here, and I thought I'd just finish off with this particular slide, which is available from my bedroom window, painted in 1990, no graffiti at all. The message is one for eons. Thank you.